Hi, and welcome to this episode of Global Scalpels. We're excited to have you, and we're excited to introduce our speaker, Marc DuBois. He has spent much of the past 4 decades working in and writing about foreign aid, humanitarian rights, advocacy, and humanitarian action. He is a prominent figure within Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, after having worked with them for nearly 15 years, which included his role as General Director of the UK section. He is also a lawyer and has worked with the US Peace Corps. And with that, we'd love to welcome Marc DuBois.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
From your background, you've written extensively about humanitarian and development work. Would you mind just walking us through your journey from civil rights litigation to General Director of MSF UK to now being an independent analyst and writer?
Yeah, it's a bit of a zigzagging path, but I'm going to go before being a lawyer. I started right after university as a Peace Corps volunteer. I worked in rural Burkina Faso doing rural development work. I was raising chickens and things like that in rural communities. And what I came away with was a sense that this isn't about technological transfer. This is about politics. And I got a master's degree in development studies and focused on the politics of development studies. And again, it went a little further, and it said something about it's about rights. Right? It's about empowerment. It's not about we need to teach these people how to raise chickens. There was no point in me teaching people how to raise chickens when they didn't have the right to own land and things like that. So I went to law school. I studied international human rights, international law, things like that. I did do civil rights work in the United States for a few years, but I missed the international. I missed being part of that big world, and I felt as if my Peace Corps skills weren't being used. For instance, being able to speak and work in foreign languages, things like that. So, one thing led to another, and a former classmate of mine from law school was with Médecins Sans Frontières, and I called her up and ended up 15 years in the organization. And I think underneath that sort of trajectory, and it really is a bit of a zigzagging with some bartending and a lot of other things in the middle, but underneath that trajectory is an idea that power matters and power dynamic matters, and understanding what's going on and not what's on the surface, but what are the underlying drivers and the culture and the processes and the structures that result in what we see in front of us and the problems we see in front of us and the problems that we're trying to address. And the second thing that runs through that is a bit of trying to escape from the moral complexity of things. I was looking, and I'm sad to say it, I was looking to be a savior. And the development world was morally complex. I couldn't figure out by the end of my Peace Corps thing whether we were doing more harm or more good there. And I rather naively got into humanitarian action because I wanted something a bit more pure. You're just saving a life. What could be less political than that? And of course, in my years in MSF and certainly since then, I've really come to doubt how morally simple that is. I think it's actually a very morally complex, field of work. So that's where I am.
It's a really exciting journey from both your personal experience and also probably a little bit of serendipity, meeting that friend along the way who led you down this path.
Much serendipity along the way, yes.
I think it's really interesting what you said in that you specifically studied the politics of development studies, and you mentioned how this is a really difficult field within humanitarian aid work. And how politically neutral aid organizations should be is an issue that many aid organizations do contend with. And where do you stand on this issue?
Yeah, neutrality is a really interesting question. It's one of the core humanitarian principles, and I think that aspect of neutrality, the rather basic definition is: look, you wouldn't let anyone come into your house if they were going to do something against you, right? If they were on the other side of some conflict, and in particular in a conflict situation, it makes a lot of sense that if you want access to people, if you want to go and to be able to deliver aid and assistance and protection to those most in need, you need to have access to them. And you're not going to get access if people think that you are operating in the furtherance of one of the sides of a conflict, right? So that, I think, with that in mind, and if you look around the world in places, in the Middle East, in many places now, in sub-Saharan Africa, in certain wars, if you don't have that neutrality, you're not going to get in. You're not going to be able to access those most in need. I think that the more complex parts of neutrality can be, for me, they're twofold. One is, what does that mean in terms of neutrality towards victims, towards people suffering, towards populations in crisis, right? Are we neutral towards those who are on the wrong end of abuse and violence? When a hospital gets bombed, are we neutral to that? And I think that's a real question with aid organizations of how do you engage with that, with maybe even solidarity with people who are in crisis, and at the same time maintain a proper level of what you might call political neutrality vis-a-vis the conflict in order to maintain your access. And that's very hard. And I think it's very hard for organizations, but it's also very hard for individuals. I think at a certain point, individuals have to make their own choices on that. And a third area, and one that doesn't get talked about much in the sector, and that I think is coming, is what about the neutrality towards what we're actually doing in a real big picture? And the reason I say that is, look, no one would expect an organization like Médecins Sans Frontières to take money from the tobacco industry or the defense industry, right? I mean, you can't take money from the defense industry to go clean up the mess they make in some other country, right? But what does that mean when a lot of what's going on in the world today is the result of inequality and social injustices that aren't just being perpetrated by, let's say, a defense industry or some, it's a lot more complex. And a lot of our donor money does come from, across the aid sector, comes from governments and comes from major corporations and comes from people who maybe aren't so neutral vis-a-vis these underlying structures of inequality and injustice. And what does that mean? And I think that's a much harder question for us. And a much harder question when you start thinking about, are we neutral to the unintended consequences of our aid? What if our humanitarian aid means that people don't try and fix the other problems that are going on, right? We're just putting Band-Aids on things. I think of humanitarian aid as very much a response to people's immediate needs, but not fixing the underlying structures. And what if we're a bit of an alibi? Are we neutral towards that? So, I mean, in some ways, people have told me I get paid to complexify things, and that's a complex way of looking at neutrality.
It is just a really difficult subject, and I think exactly what you say is true probably for the healthcare workers, in that there's a difference between the people they're seeing on the ground and that sort of instinct to help others, and then trying to separate that and disentangle that from, like you said, the political structures that are funding their work and also that are causing the humanitarian organization to be required in the first place.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The purity of the act is quite simple, right? Whether you're sewing somebody up in your surgery, or whether you're reaching a hand out of a boat to pull somebody out of the water, or providing food to somebody who doesn't have enough food, that's very simple. That's as human and a manifestation of human compassion that is absolutely gorgeous. But it's within a context, and that context is complex and gives meaning to it that you have no control over. And that's what's hard.
Absolutely. And I think you've described a really complex topic really well in just a very short period of time. One thing that you mentioned earlier was this whole idea of power dynamics, and that's something that does come up quite a lot. And within the aid sector, how do you think that they can find the balance between providing aid and supporting the local health infrastructure sustainably without undermining the role of the state?
Yeah, the aid sector has been asking itself that question for a long time. And one of the problems in the aid sector essentially is that it doesn't really control what it does. There are a lot of the aid sector is dependent on what donors will give money for, right? And to a certain extent, the aid sector 20 years ago said we need to be more accountable to people on the ground, and it's still struggling with that. Everyone in the sector agrees with it, and yet can't deliver on it. Or we need better community engagement from the humanitarian standpoint. We can't just show up to places and do stuff. We need to talk and engage with communities. And over and over and over and over again, the community gets left out, right? And if I'm speaking in very critical, broad brushstrokes. Of course, there's community engagement that goes on, but by and large, this is a real sticking point. And what I'm getting at is I actually don't think that the sector can do much here. I think that balance that you asked about has to come from the outside. If you think about balancing on the scales, I think the sector is kind of lost on its own scale in this. And it actually is for communities and for governments and for other actors to impose some balance, to take some balance on the humanitarian community. And this is a very difficult thing. It's hard. It's hard to get that balance when you don't have that much control over what humanitarians do. But that for me is the only way the balance is going to come. It's not about what the aid sector does. It's about what the external world to the aid sector does that will create better balance.
Thank you so much, Marc. I think we really learned a lot today and talked about some really important topics. And so for those of you who would like to hear the rest of the episode, you can check out globalscalpels.com or get on iTunes or any of your favorite podcast episode players and be able to listen to the rest of this episode. And we thank you for joining us today.